Good afternoon, everybody. I don't play golf, so that was never an option. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge, amongst all the other speakers, Adam Shoemaker, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University, which covers the area that I represented for many years. So I've had the pleasure of seeing Adam in action in the past. Good. It feels precocious. It is precocious to give you my view on everything after 4 weeks, so I won't. I'm into sort of straight talking, so even doing a keynote speech feels a little sort of grandiose. But I'm happy to share some perspectives of someone who's been an outsider who's now on your side. I mean, even if you might be multiple sides in this room, I'm on all of your sides. I've had my investiture ceremony, which I understand not all VCs have, so I've already annoyed half the ones who didn't. I have had the chance to meet the Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors of the other 38 universities. I've hosted my first sausage sizzle amongst the students, so I've had a lot of fun so far. I'm on a steep learning curve about both the University of Canberra and Australia's higher education sector. I know it's a complex sector, but I think you are crucial, we are crucial to our future as a country. It's key to our future, in fact, in the world. But you, now we, now us, are seriously undersold. When I say undersold, I don't mean in a sort of, oh, well, if they just communicate better, everything will be better. I genuinely think that many Australians do not have a clue what happens at universities. Now, that may sound vaguely shocking, or may sound you mightn't even agree. Surely everyone knows what we do. Well, I'm here to tell you a lot of people do not. They're not aware that we could be within a few short years of solving lupus. They're not aware that we train the nurses, the doctors, the teachers, that we're doing the stuff. There'll be people sitting in parts of Australia fulminating against the wokeness and the culture wars of university as they sit on their tractors using laser guidance and use genetically modified research about genetically modified food, which is actually extending the productivity of their farms. So there is a big challenge out there. I am lucky to bring fresh eyes. They won't remain fresh eyes, but they are right now. Fresh eyes looking at the University of Canberra, and what I've seen there, people say, what have you found in your first 4 weeks? I actually think it's quite amazing what they're doing there. I actually have been stunned. It's excellent. I realise that I'm at a university where I'm not sure people realise how good they are. And then I'm enjoying using my fresh eyes to look at the whole of higher education sector from the ramparts of being pro-higher education sector. But it is very clear that the world in which you all operate, which I now operate in, is changing very fast. And again, you've heard the changing proposition before, you sort of objectively know it, you're in it. But next election, there'll be some international student caps. That's just a fact. There is a challenge of a dwindling domestic market for higher ed. Again, like all generalisations, of course there's exceptions to the rule, but this is true. There's a decrease in government funding for operating costs, which has been underway for a generation, from 80% in 1989 to 40%, less than 40% today. Research and development, which I know is more than higher ed, but higher ed's at the centre of it, is now down to about 1.65% of GDP. The trend is not our friend in higher education. And I think that for too long, higher education's been viewed as not a whipping boy, even though some of you might feel whipped, but certainly not appreciated. It's a challenge. Just as a little aside, because it's part of my ongoing therapy, if you didn't vote for me in 2019, blame yourself. And in 2016 as well. because I did take a policy of 3% of R&D, GDP, to the election. Wouldn't that be good now? Anyway, that's enough. My therapist says it's important for me to do that. I'm actually joking, sort of. The Australian universities are seriously underestimated in Australia. And that doesn't mean that the individual components are entirely underestimated, but they really are, as a collective, underestimated. So I'm absolutely not here, 4 weeks in, to try and give you the solution to everything, because that's not possible. I'm not, for the students of ancient Greek literature, I'm not the escapee from Plato's cave out here to provide the light to the human race. But there are some, I think, core observations I'd like to share with you. Not necessarily just based on the last 4 weeks, but perhaps the last 20 years in public life. The metaphor which I'm most comfortable using to explain higher education to people is that the education and research impact of universities are a bit like a river running through a hinterland, indeed through the towns, feeding crops, watering stock, carrying commerce, giving life and purpose to all the areas around it. The people along its banks and in the hinterland reap its benefits, but I'm not sure they're stopping to pause too often to think about the various elements of daily life that it's supporting. So I think, much like a river, our universities are not always recognised as a fundamental precondition to social and economic progress. And we certainly, though, don't want to get to a point where we only realise the value of a university, a bit like a river, when it's gone. We have world-class institutions, but I think that there is an overdue positive conversation to be had with the Australian people telegraphing our value. You cannot assume people know what we do. In saying that conversation, I'm not asking them to reach into their lives and to simply just ask people what we need to do is restore their trust. I think, though, making the case for universities, not just telling people, aren't we good, look at this. But what I have learned is that explaining to people that previously we invented something, discovered something at a university, and that we should just say, well, we've done that, therefore aren't we good? That isn't, I think, enough anymore. It is interesting, and I've had a look at why was it during COVID, when thousands of jobs were lost, there wasn't more outcry about the fate of academic and general staff at universities? Tens of thousands of jobs disappeared. But where was the outcry? How was it possible for a previous government, Mr Morrison's, to keep changing the rules of JobKeeper eligibility to exclude university staff? Like, you've really got to think about being mean to do that. But what's more is, why was there no blowback? I think if you were to ask 99 out of 100 Australians, did you know that happened? They would say no. I think what we've done is give society and our community the rationale to support us, but not the emotional connection to fall in love with us and to value us. Now, I know that sounds a little soppy, and it's probably not enough data in that to satisfy the hungry minds in here. But former Higher Education Minister Kim Carr, I think, put it well in his recently launched book, A Long March. He said that when he was Minister for Science, he often had scientists come to him believing that if they just presented a solution to the problem to the right person, the merits would be instantly evident, and voila, it will be transformed into funding and action. Kim said he'd often have to break the news to scientists. The politics is actually much more of an emotional process than simply a rational process. I think that appealing to the community and rebuilding some of the licence, making people want to fight for us, to appreciate us enough to care what happens, I think that's in part also an emotional process. One example I've seen, which we're doing at UC, it's what we call the Indigenous Leadership Strategy. We call it an outside-in approach to our mission, and we are seeking emotional connection. The challenge posed to us is to listen to Indigenous communities in which our university has a presence, to understand that they participate in their own priorities and attain their own outcomes. So it is about partnership with Indigenous people who are part of the oldest living culture in the world, not to dictate our operational plan, but to identify where we align, where we can add value, how we can truly collaborate in the spirit of practical self-determination so that communities can thrive and they can feel some ownership of us. Bringing these communities in means our teaching, research and outreach has to be targeted, has to be more targeted, more efficient, more effective. And it'll make us a more attractive institution to which people feel they have a stake in. I think this approach, the outside-in approach, is a worthwhile template for how we shape our curricula generally. Targeted, effective, efficient, and importantly relevant. People have to feel they have a stake in us, and when they do, they will fight for us. But if they see us as a disconnected silo on a hill, away from their experiences and their engagement and their empowerment and relevant to their lives, well, we're on our own. This is not unique to the higher education sector. In fact, what interests me so much upon my arrival here is not the differences between higher education and other parts of Australian life, but the similarity. One thing is for sure, and again, I give no lecture to the other 38 universities, but one thing which I'm certainly conscious of for the University of Canberra is that we can't simply do the things that they've always been done and expect a different outcome. I mentioned COVID, that had a massive impact, but not just on staff, but on how we teach and the students and how students want to learn. It had a big psychological impact on people. I mean, I'm from Melbourne, so we really went through it. That's something which Melbourne people will acknowledge, and the rest of you will say so. But in all seriousness, it changed a generation of kids. It delayed them for a couple of years. It is massive, the repercussions of that experience. But what was also interesting is I feel that during COVID, we also recognised that life is too short. You know, to use the good China, to utilise our time differently. I think there was also, during COVID, but not just COVID, and around it and before it, but after it, but very much noticeably, is that it feels like things are speeding up. And watching American politics is only just absolutely, I mean, drinking from the fire hose has new meaning. But AI, new industries, accepted norms, they are changing. I think there's a view sometimes in higher ed that we just have to withstand particular ministers or particular governments, but we've always been here and we always will. Why do you think that? Why is any body or any institution automatically guaranteed longevity? So I think that as changes happen more quickly than our current decision-making structures allow us to respond, that is a challenge. The truth of the matter is that some of the university lunch is being eaten by TAFE. Because TAFE has won an argument, and that's fine for TAFE, and I see education, adult education, as important in all walks. But they've won an argument which says that if you want to meet a skill shortage, use TAFE. No one thinks that you can bridge short-term skill shortages by going to university. But that is a problem. If things are changing and the need for skills acquisition is speeding up, then why do we still have the same slow delivery systems? We must, I mean, I just see again at UC, so I'm not, you know, no doubt many of the other universities are just killing it and doing well, so perhaps we're just the outlier, but maybe not, is that we're good at our educational partnerships. We're sort of good at talking to government, but I'm not sure we're so good at talking to everyone else and our partnerships elsewhere. Industries are open to us helping skill up their workforce, but the fact that there is such a profusion, and it's not an overnight thing, this trend's been going for 20 years, in non-TAFE, non-university education providers shows that there are gaps which we haven't filled. The fact that international universities can provide online courses to Aussies here shows there is demand but we're not necessarily meeting it. Parents still want to give their kids a brighter future. Industries still want help skilling up their workforce. There's more call than ever for researchers to find ways to combat wicked problems that we face. But nothing is inevitable. Bologna, which lays claim to being the oldest Western university, mind you, when I was preparing this, sort of so does Paris. Krakau's having a... Anyway, I love history. But let's go with Bologna at the moment. It slowly built its identity in the 11th and 12th centuries. It did flourish during parts of the Middle Ages, the early Renaissance. But then when religious mores became more strict, when they had the political power to impose a profession of fairly orthodox faith upon students, staff and what was learned, it stagnated. Many students of other faiths no longer felt welcome, and what was once a mighty institution whose diverse, inclusive community was its strength went into a period of decline. And these periods of decline, it took centuries for the university to be revived and to regain its standing. I wonder when you look at that university or other metaphorical or other universities who've enjoyed moments of great illumination and excitement, does their decline match a breach in the social contract to share knowledge that it held with all knowledge seekers, those whose study and research would in turn broaden and deepen the knowledge base? I think, in the case of my modern university, our social contract remains true to that of the ancient institutions, with the addition of a commitment to meet people where they are, speaking to those who, rightly or wrongly, have lost confidence in us, or people who feel that the brilliant public universities, which we all work for and love, which have dotted our broad continent, they feel that they no longer belong to them. Again, I remember when my mum explained that she was the first in her family to go to university in the early 1950s. Working class Australians, bright working class Australians, women in particular, did not feel that higher education spoke to them, and even if the metal fences had been torn down during the Second World War to supply armaments, but they were still excluded. I worry, though, that whilst the fences are down and there's been absolute improvement in accessibility to universities, I worry that there's many of our fellow Australians who, for whatever they want to do in life, whatever dreams and hopes and aspirations they have, they don't see a university as part of the mechanism to change that, to achieve that. We need not to just rely on people stumbling across us, to stumble across our teaching and our research. I feel that the barriers that higher education has to including more Australians do exist. I don't think there is a great well of elitism running rampant across all Australian universities. Maybe a little bit, but not a great well. But I do say to you, as an outsider coming in, that many Australians do not see higher education as relevant to their lives. I think that is a disaster. Because this nation needs adults with a lifelong love of learning more than ever. Our liberal democracy requires critical thinking more than ever. Now, the barriers to people why they don't go to university, again, you're all veterans, you could probably get up and give this talk too, but it's worth hearing some of them again. Because if we all know the problem, then the really alarming question is, why haven't we solved it? And people might say, we are solving it. Okay, well, if you want to attend a self-congratulation party, I'm not your speaker. The reality is that we're not solving it as much as we could. The reality is the social licence of universities is under threat. Now, we can say people are just stupid, or we can say that people are bogans, or we can say it's just the, the rise of the alt-right. We can say whatever we want. But if people are not buying what we're selling, then blaming everyone else is not necessarily our solution that we're looking for. Think about someone who might have left school at year 12, but now they're in their 40s. The idea of coming back to further study is frankly horrifying and scary. Think about a single mum trying to do battle with the deadbeat dad for the child support, trying to balance the income, trying to get the kids to school. How on earth could they contemplate upskilling at a university? How about people who don't have a university down the road? People in regional Australia? People whose cultural experience is not to come from a world of university graduates? The question I'm asking myself is, how can I unleash the University of Canberra to these audiences? So I'm not here to give advice to anyone else, but I am saying that these are the problems which I'm now in the fortunate position to try and address actively and proactively by rejuvenating our campus. I'm not shy about putting myself out there, which will lead to some frustration amongst you periodically if I say something that you don't agree with. But I know one thing: life is too short to leave a song or a speech within you not said. And I think that the fight to renew institutions worth renewing is a pretty virtuous fight. I used to work at the Australian Workers' Union. I became their leader. It was gone for all money, but we rejuvenated it and rebuilt it. After the 2013 federal election, one of the reasons I got elected leader, other than I got more votes than the other guy, was that I think people thought at 54 seats out of 150, I might be a passable night watchman till better people came along. But we made us electable within one election. When Kevin Rudd put me into disability services as a baby politician years ago, I think he sort of did it because he didn't know where to put me and he didn't really want me too close to him. That's okay. But we created the NDIS from there. So you can rejuvenate disability services. The NDIS is now bigger than R&D in Australia, expenditure-wise. So things can change. What I've learned from all of these things, though, and people have asked me, outside of university life, how have you found university life? I've said that it's a bit like, I imagine, well, I know how to drive, but flying. You know, the Airbus is a very different, if any of you know pilots, the Airbus is very different to the Boeing. But there's some core skills about flying which are the same. And I think that by leading by influence and edict, to me, universities is about people, it's about judgment, it's about bringing and unifying people. So I think that we've got an opportunity here. That's why I wanted to speak today. Not because I think I have the answers, but I am definitely on the side of higher education. I think that higher education, the individual parts are greater than the sum of the parts at the moment in Australia. We're kicked from pillar to post on every individual issue. But those individual issues, by the way, are legitimate. I was at a session with some Vice-Chancellors where we say, how do you handle outrage? The answer, which was in my head, is don't cause outrage. There should be no reason for wages theft. Our payroll systems are big enough. You can get the odd pay wrong, but there shouldn't be the reason for the extent of it. People should feel safe on campus. Women should absolutely feel safe. We know to do that. International students, if there's a debate about them, it's because we haven't explained what we do about them. Anti-Semitism. Australians of Jewish heritage have a right to feel safe. There is no academic freedom which says it's okay to make people feel unsafe. But it's not even those individual matters. Then there's the wages of, VCs. Thank you. But we haven't been making the debates. And so if we don't set the agenda, public life in this country is a bit like nature. It hates a vacuum. If we don't fill the agenda, then others will. And if we can't recognise that sometimes some of the criticisms have a grain of truth, then I think it becomes very hard to deal with the challenges. Australia needs what higher education can offer. The skill sets in higher education of our staff, of our teaching, of our research are actually extraordinary. It's a pleasure to discover. Life on campus is actually a gift. Young people wanting to learn, people committed to study and teaching, people committed to the search for data and evidence to draw conclusions about how we can organise society better. It's sort of quite a miraculous environment. And I've really loved even just in the very beginning days and weeks to feel the potential. But the challenge really is, how do we explain this to people outside the world of higher education? And I think that comes from recognising truth. And the truth is that not everyone feels included in the higher education journey. We can decry the rise of populism, we can decry the rise of ministers who may or may not seem to know what they're talking about, we can decry the rise of culture wars, all of that's true. But I think there are things that you can't control, and then there are things you can control. So I'm looking forward to working with the other 38 universities. I'm looking forward to a bit of that outside in that we talked about with our Indigenous Leadership Program. I think there's a marvellous case to be made. I've worked with institutions in far greater trouble than my university or universities generally, but I think it's a recognition that we need to bring people with us, and I think there's room for improvement there. Thanks very much.
We've got time for just a couple of questions for Bill before the break for lunch. Does anyone have any burning questions? One just here. Oh, thanks, Marie.
Thanks, John Ross from Times Higher Education magazine. Thanks for a great speech. That was really entertaining, Vice-Chancellor. It feels funny to call you Vice-Chancellor, but hi, Vice-Chancellor.
It's all right.
Look, you mentioned Vice-Chancellor's pay as one of the issues contributing to the loss of social licence. So your predecessor as substantive Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, running the third smallest publicly funded university in the country, was paid an all-time record, about 3 times what you would have earned if more people had voted for you in 2019. The university's never really explained why he was paid so much in his final year, sort of citing privacy. Is the university going to come clean on the circumstances around this?
Well, let's remove some of your pejorative language about come clean. First of all, I'm not the curator of the Museum of UC History. So I'm not about to give you a story that you didn't already have, but part of the settlement in terms of his final year was a notice provision. See, that's the thing, and I understand there's no way a Vice-Chancellor, I mean, I'm not saying anything about that, but you basically bundled up a notice provision, like 2 years' wages into one. It's up to you if you ever write that. I've given up on trying to win those arguments, but that's just a fact. So you've used 2 years' data and called it 1 year. But beyond that, I've run campaigns against people's wages and I've run campaigns for people's wages. It's a killing field for the Vice-Chancellors to be out there arguing their own wages. Because there's what, 38 of them, 39 of them? Like you've lost before you started. It's a bit like politicians' wages, I recognise that argument. We could have cut our pay, and I'm not saying this is the same as Vice-Chancellors, but it's up to you what you think. They wouldn't have been happy if politicians in Canberra until they were camping on the lawn and hitchhiking from their home. Like, the wages debate is not where we need to be. I don't know what is the right metric for people to use. All of a sudden I see the Treasurer's wage is now the new stabilising factor. I think if a Vice-Chancellor's performing well, they're probably worth the money. They're complex positions. But I'll leave it to other Vice-Chancellors to defend that. All I know is I practice what I preach. I cut my wage. If you could write that in big letters, I'd be impressed. But I'm not holding my breath because that doesn't fit the narrative, people cutting their wages. I think the real issue is not the wages, although that's a legitimate topic of inquiry. It is, do people think they're getting value for money from Australia's universities? That's the challenge. Mind you, I look at the wages in the private sector, they're well in excess of these. So we get benchmarked against a politician. No one benchmarks the University of Sydney or the University of Melbourne against the Commonwealth Bank or the head of a superannuation fund. I think the real challenge is universities demonstrating that the students are getting a great experience, the teaching is good quality, the researchers feel supported, and the communities in which these universities are embedded feel they're getting value. So Yeah, I think I've answered specifically your point about one of my predecessors, but more generally, either universities fill the vacuum of Australian life with a narrative of what they're contributing, or you will have a string of these individual issues. It's okay to question, though, universities. Like, as I think I said in my presentation, some outrage is legitimate. How can you have a situation where staff were not being paid properly? How do you have a situation where people do not feel safe? How do you have a situation where Australians of Jewish heritage in some universities think about dropping out of university altogether, or academic staff feel threatened? So not all criticisms of universities are wrong. I think that's the first thing to start at. It's not so much do people not appreciate us, but some critiques are correct. I think it's very early days. I'm interested in exploring how we demonstrate and create value for our students, our staff, and the broader community. If we can answer that question, our value proposition, then I think people put up with some of the other stuff. You can have a less heated debate and a little bit legitimate discussions about governance. Are we really the third littlest? Okay, I'll work on that.
One more question up the back and then we'll have to break for lunch.
Hi, my name's Amanda Barney. I'm from Macquarie University. I love the way that you talked about the emotional connection that we need to engender in universities. For me, universities have been a love story in the kind of work that we do. So I wondered if you could share your advice about, for academic colleagues in leadership roles, how do we support them as well to develop the skills in a really complex environment as it's been over the last 5 years to sort of change their ways of working? So what strategies or have you used in the past to also bring that an organisation's community towards these new ways of telling better stories, and so what could leaders do in a sense to make sure that that works from within and it's ready for that intersection from the outside in?
Well, again, I won't give advice to any other university, but that's a question I'm asking myself about how I can support our academic staff at UC. And I think it's about changing 1% of what we do, not 99%. I think sometimes fresh eyes are required. I get that it's a bit of a punt for UC to pick a non-academic to be the VC, but we've got hundreds of academics, so maybe that doesn't hurt. Maybe what we need is some fresh eyes. I'm going to try and validate and vindicate that confidence. I will. When I say change the 1%, your staff, your students and your researchers are very interesting people. And I think it's taking the time to just appreciate what they do and how that relates to the world outside of university. I'm not saying that every research project into sort of how field mice burrow is going to immediately lead to Infosys creating some new software. I'm not saying that it doesn't all have to tie up A, B, C. But I think there's a lot of good news in your campuses which we're not getting out. Now, as any media here know, there's an old saying that when good news is getting up and dressed in the morning, bad news is off and running. So I'm not naive, but I think there's a lot more good news out there. I think social media, human stories, portraying that through different mediums of communication, but always asking, if you can answer this question in any story, it's how does what this is doing help someone else? Now, sometimes that's a long bow, but sometimes it's a bit closer and a bit more direct than people realise. I think the other thing is, in a university, some stories are more relatable to community than others. We have to work together. You shouldn't be upset if one area doesn't quite get the same public attention as another, because I think that as university, if there's a rising tide of support for universities, that lifts all the boats anyway. But it's understanding the good news and the relevance to community and what we're doing. And I hope to work with UC and the academics. The thing I'm most looking forward to is just getting to understand what they do. You know, in our education faculty, they're doing marvellous work about helping 0 to 5-year-olds acquire STEM skills. They're working on work to help neurodivergent kids learn better in schools. That is actually incredibly relevant to every parent in Australia. Like, it's very, very, very powerful. Talking to some of my pharmacy students, Masters of Pharmacy students, that's immense, some of the work that they're doing. So there's a lot more good news under the cover if we're a bit better at looking for it. Again, I'll finish on this caveat. I know that all of you are doing all of this, So I do feel quite genuinely a bit precocious suggesting to you things which you may already be doing, but I don't think it requires a great change in direction. One other thing I'd say is politics is a lot different these days. I think there's a model of politics which says you go to a closed room, you talk to the right decision maker in the department or the government, and then that solves it. No, I think if the people know what we do, the politicians will follow. Thanks.
Bill Shorten's up next.